which is a great honor for me. So we have David Pesetsky from MIT, who is the Ferrari P. Ward Professor of Linguistics at MIT. He was an undergraduate at Yale University and got his PhD from MIT in linguistics. After that, he taught at USC and UMass Amherst before returning to MIT, and he's where he's been for many years. For those of you in linguistics, he's extremely well known in the area of syntactic theory. He has various monographs in many papers in syntax, including the book Zero Syntax in 1994 is the best good enough in 1998, Phrasal Movement and its Kin in 2000, something else coming out very soon on Russian, and his dissertation was also in Russian, one of the first things that I read when I was an undergraduate in linguistics. Very inspirational for me. He's also done some very significant collaborations within syntactic theory. So with Danny Fox, the theory of cyclic linearization, which is extremely well known in the syntax community, and also a set of recent papers with Esther Torrego on T to C movement. And if you don't know what that is, you probably don't want to read those papers. But he's also worked in areas outside of the core syntactic literature and linguistics, and in particular, he's been very involved in making sure that people in the larger intellectual community understand what linguists actually know and what they don't know. One particularly well-known case is the debate about piraha and whether the exceptionality, and has a couple of papers with Andrew Nevins and Selene Rodriguez on piraha exceptionality, responding to Dan Everett's claims about that, which are good reading for everybody who hasn't read them. And at the recent LSA, he was the plenary speaker, also talked about the way linguistics is misunderstood and misrepresented in the larger community, and he put an end to all of that. He's also worked on on educational issues, how reading should be taught, and the role of phonics and syntax and all of that. But today he's going to talk about one of his other interests, which is the connection between music and language, which is also collaboration. I think he'll tell us about your collaborator. So, David Pesetsky.
Thank you. So let's see. Push a little down there. I don't have total blackness, but you should be able to see. So that's pretty good, right? Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Okay. So thank you for the nice introduction. Thank you for the invitation. So this is indeed collaborative work with Jonah Katz, who was a graduate student in our department, and then spent 2 years as a postdoc in Paris, and is now a postdoc in Berkeley. So he's doing a tour of all the nice places on the planet. But before that, he was at Cambridge, Massachusetts. And for both of us, probably unlike most of the speakers today, except perhaps, I'm not sure, but except perhaps of John Nicole, this is not our day job working on music and its structure, but for both of us, we are sort of passionate musicians in different ways, and we're both linguists, and we started talking while Jonah was a student in our department, and produced a paper that's still under revision and under development, but the talk that I'm going to give today is an extract from that and based on that. So also, unlike most of the talks we heard today, it's a theoretician's talk. So I want to put out some ideas and give some arguments for them, but I don't have any ERPs to show you. We didn't separate jazz musicians by barriers. So that all lies in the future, that kind of work with the topics that we're going to talk about today. So, to some extent, some of my introductory material has already been covered by earlier talks, so I will go a little bit more quickly than I might otherwise through some points that have been very well and very eloquently discussed by other people already today. So, there are two conflicting intuitions about language and its relation to music. So on the one hand, there's a bunch of ways, some of them obvious, some of them not obvious, but true, in which music and language appear to be deeply different. Right? So you see some of them on the slide in front of you. They manipulate pitch differently. It might, in fact, not turn out to be true, but as far as people know at the moment, this is a point Patel makes in his book, isochronous beat is a component of musical rhythm, quite commonly not of speech. Music is felt to have a meaning, but nonetheless, a musical phrase cannot be judged true or false. There's no formal semantics for music. We'll come back to that point later, and so on. At the same time, there's an intuition that music and language are deeply similar in many ways. So they can be rhythmically organized in commensurable ways, as we just heard in the previous talk and the introduction to that talk. They're both law-governed and complex systems that vary in some ways, but maybe not in every possible way across cultures. Every culture appears to have language, the same is true of music, and they both develop spontaneously in humans and seem to be supported by a range of innate capacities that can be detected even in newborns, and so on. So they're similar and they're different. And these conflicting intuitions correlate with two traditions in the discussion of language and music. So first of all, supporting that, or in light of the obvious differences, there are two distinct academic disciplines that study the formal structure of music and language. So music theory on the one hand and linguistic theory on the other. And they differ in their descriptive apparatus, and they differ in many ways in their intellectual goals. On the other hand, there is a literature, much of it perhaps unfortunately speculative and informal, and maybe you'll judge this talk to have the same unfortunate qualities, but maybe we'll improve slightly on that. Right, that links music to language and focuses on their similarities. So Bernstein's lectures are the most famous example of that. So because the various cognitive sciences have inherited, so there's a consensus. And the consensus is that music and language are more different than similar. That's a consensus that's being chipped away at, and we heard discussion of that today. But I think it's fair, like we read Patel's book, and that's largely the consensus. And because the cognitive sciences have inherited this consensus, in particular, the consensus view that the formal systems that govern linguistic and musical structure are distinct, most of the research that compares language and music concerns issues of use rather than the formal structure and the nature of the rule systems. And so they ask questions like, are the memory resources shared by the processing of music and language? Is there selective impairment of musical and linguistic skills, and so on? These are important questions, and I don't mean to diss them, and they are even related to the questions that I'm going to take up. But there's a certain skewing of the discussion that you can find in the literature. So whenever you find that music and language maybe share some of the source, it's often taken as a contribution to the topic of domain specificity, because it's presumed that language and music are distinct domains. So when they share something, it's a suggestion, as in the bowling ball diagrams that we've seen in several people's slides, that there are resources shared by distinct formal systems. So Jonah and I would like to question that consensus. So what I'd like to suggest is that the syntax of music and the syntax of language, when properly compared, might actually be formally identical. The exciting possibility would be identical in every detail. So there's some history to our discussion, and to a great extent, both in reality and also in part because of time limitations, a lot of what I'm going to present today is not really new at all, but a kind of a recasting of some old things. So as many of you know, in 1973, Leonard Bernstein gave lectures at Harvard about language and music that were published as The Unanswered Questions, 6 talks at Harvard. You can now see the original lectures on DVD. And in the audience was the linguist Ray Jackanoff and Fred Laerdal, who got together and decided that it might be interesting to sort of do Bernstein right? That is to go with his intuition that there is something deeply similar about language and music that can be discovered, but to use the formal tools of serious music theory and the formal tools of linguistic theory and the eye and mind of a music theorist and a linguist to try to see what music might look like if viewed in the systematic way from a linguistic perspective. And the result, as we know, is this book, GTTM, A Generative Theory of Tonal Music, that was published in 1983, summing up about a half a decade of previous work. And they, in turn, relied on a tradition in music theory that some of you know all too well. For those of you who don't, I'll just mention it briefly. right? For them, their idea, which I think was a good one, was that traditional music theory should play much the same role in their investigation as, say, traditional grammar plays in modern linguistics. It's a body of knowledge constructed by intelligent people looking at a complex domain. So GTTM assumes most of traditional music theory. And in particular, it also assumes some of the ideas of the famous Austrian music theorist Heinrich Schenker, who they saw as prefiguring a sort of Chomskyan approach to music in ways that were of particular importance to them. So the starting point of Jonah and my investigation is, in fact, this book, GTTM. Now, what we would like to argue is that when Lerdahl and Jakadov's conclusions about music, their model, the GTTM model, is reworked in a format commensurate with modern linguistic theory and compatible with its goals, we'd like to argue that we may conclude that the syntactic structures of both music and language are built by exactly the same rule that Chomsky and other people have called merge. And in the paper, but not in the talk for reasons of time, we also argue that the information flow and architecture of the overall model that we think might be right for language is actually quite parallel with the overall model, the overall architecture that might be right for musical structure as well. So we'd like to argue then that music and language structures are identical. Now, music and language are not identical. So what's not the same about these two domains? So our idea is that what's not the same are the building blocks of musical and linguistic syntax. So the building blocks of linguistic syntax are words and parts of words called morphemes that are listed in a mental database called the lexicon. And the members of this database, which linguists call lexical items, are arbitrary pairings of sound and meaning. Dog, furry animal with 4 legs that licks you, and so forth. And lexical items have no obvious counterpart in music. The building blocks of total musical structure that concern pitch class, E-flat, and chord quality, dominant E-flat triad, dominant seventh, and so on. And these likewise have no linguistic analogs, and we take that at face value. That's just true. So in a nutshell, what we suggest is that what language and music have in common is not their building blocks, but what they do with them. So another name we sometimes give for this talk is same recipe, different ingredients. So we state this as what we call the identity thesis for language and music. All formal differences between language and music are a consequence of differences in their fundamental building blocks, pairings of sound and music in the case of sound and meaning in the case of language, pitch class and pitch class combinations in the case of music, and in all other respects, language and music are identical. So that would mean that music and language, in an abstract sense at least, should count as the same cognitive domain in many respects. And we really build strongly on GTTM and many of its conclusions. So our identity thesis might seem a little funny to those of you who know GTTM because it was explicitly rejected by the authors of GTTM. On many places in the book, they caution their readers that the generative music theory that they have developed, quote, does not look much like generative linguistics, like Chomskyan linguistics, the kind of linguistics that the faculty of linguistics here and elsewhere pursue. We have a couple of responses to this. So first of all, in several technical respects, GTTM was actually a decade or more ahead of developments in linguistic theory. There are several aspects of the GTTM model that resemble current ideas in linguistics much more closely than they resemble ideas of the late 1970s when Lerdahl and Jakadov did their work on music. Also, conceptually, the goals of GTTM differ from the goals of most generative linguistics. The difference affected how they presented their model. So GTTM was explicitly concerned with the following question. Given a piece of music or a series of musical events, what analysis does a skilled listener assign to it? It was much less concerned with the formal question, what's the logical structure of the rule systems that license the analyses that listeners provide for pieces? And that other question that they really don't attend to in as much detail is the question that's at the heart of generative linguistics, the study of rule systems for languages. There's no value judgment here, right? There's a thriving and rich field of psycholinguistics or sentence processing that asks commensurable questions about language to those that Lerol and Jakadov asked about music. But what they did, and I think this was a mistake, was they asked a sort of a parsing question about music and developed a model, and then looked at work in linguistics that wasn't about parsing at all, but was about the underlying logic of the rule system, and said, look, these things look different, right? So our conclusion then is that language and music are basically different. They concluded that it was useful and interesting to look at music with a linguist's eye, or else why publish this long and hairy book, right? But at the same time, when you do that, they said it doesn't look like language. And we think that's because they were asking questions that were not the same, not comparable questions to the ones that linguists asked, the linguists who wrote the books that they said, you know, produce theories that look nothing like what GTTM says music looks like. So, am I just giving you a book report on GTTM? Well, if I were, that would be useful too, but not really. Right? What we do in the paper, and what I'll try to do a little bit of implicitly in the talk, is realign the GTTM model with generative linguistics, which allows both similarities and differences to be examined more meaningfully, sensibly, than GTTM itself did. And Jonah and I think that this realignment in interesting ways supports the identity thesis. So there are linguists in the audience, but I know there are non-linguists as well. So let's talk a little bit about linguistics. So how do you build a sentence out of its building blocks? So linguists are in the habit of representing the phrases of utterances of sentences of languages like English as a hierarchical structure. So in a sentence like the girl will read the book is a phrase embedded in a bigger phrase. Read the book, which is embedded in a bigger phrase, will read the book, which in turn, and the girl is another phrase, and the girl will read the book as a whole as a sentence. Okay? So we represent that with diagrams of that sort. Just some abbreviations. T is for tense, D is for determiner, which is a fancy linguist name for things like the definite article the, V for verb, N for noun, and you can ignore these little bar notations for the purposes of the talk. So the building blocks of structures of this sort are the lexical items that I mentioned. So when the girl will read the book, right, we're able to understand and use that sentence because we have in our heads memorized pairings of sound, book, meaning, right, sound, meaning, and so on, along with some other purely grammatical information like part of speech in a lexicon that contains lots and lots of these things, and there's lots of fancy things to say about lexicons. And then we have a rule that puts these building blocks, these lexical items together, called the rule merge. Okay? So what merge does is it constructs a phrase by taking two elements, let's call them X and Y, where either or both of X and Y can be one of two things. Right? They can be, X or Y or both can be lexical items, the things we saw, 2 slides ago. Right? They can be a set already formed by merge. So it either takes two lexical items and puts them together to form a set, or it takes a lexical item and a set that merge already formed and puts them together to form a bigger set, or it takes two sets that merge already formed, puts them together to form an even bigger set. And it does something else. It picks one member of the set X, Y that it just formed as special, calling it the head of the phrase. So it's a recursive rule, right, that takes a pair of lexical items or something that the rule previously formed, puts them together, right, keeps doing this for a while, and each time it does this, one element of the phrase that it constructed is chosen as the head of the phrase. And the head gives the phrase its name. So if you put together the determiner the with the noun book, right, you form a nominal phrase. Many linguists think that the head of those phrases is a determiner the. That's controversial, but I'll label it DP throughout this talk to conform to prevailing thought on the matter. Right? So we take the lexical items the and book together, and we form a phrase called a DP. Then we can go to the lexicon and take the verb read and merge that with the DP we just formed, giving us the verb phrase, read the book. And linguists think that the head of that phrase is the verb read, hence the name verb phrase. Then we can take the tense element will, combine it with the verb phrase that we just formed, giving us will read the book. Meanwhile, we can merge the and girl together, giving us the nominal phrase, the DP, the girl, and then we can take the girl and will read the book, put them together. Linguists think the head of that is the tense element will, forming the entire sentence, which we can also call a tense phrase, the girl will read the book. So it's just a result of recursively applying the rule merge. The two ingredients can either both be phrases previously formed by merge, they can be lexical items, or they can be a lexical item and a phrase previously formed by merge, building a sentence out of the fundamental building blocks of lexical items. Okay? And by the way, the whole thing can be made into a subordinate clause by just continuing the process of merge, as you see in this slide. Okay? And each time we merge something, we chose one element as its head. Okay? And heads are important in lots of ways in language. So for example, heads care about what they're merged with. Right? So the English subordinating conjunction, that merges only with finite tenses. And and another kind of subordinating conjunction, for, merges only with infinitives. So I could say that Mary, read the book, that Mary will read the book is fine, or for Mary to read the book would be fine, but not that Mary to read the book would be fine, or for Mary will read the book is fine. So a complementizer subordinating conjunction cares about what it merges with. Tense cares about the morphology, the endings on the verb of the verb phrase that it merges with, and verbs care about whether they do or do not merge with nominals and prepositional phrases. That's what it means to be transitive or intransitive. Languages also care about the order of heads and non-heads. So in a head initial English, language like English, the head of a phrase systematically precedes the element that it merged with. Okay? So for example, you say, read books, not books read, and will read books. Right? The will comes before the verb phrase, not after it, and so on. Okay? There are head final languages that do just the opposite. So in a language like Japanese, you don't say read books, you say books read. And you don't say will read books, you say books read will. And you don't say I believe that Mary will read books, you say Mary books read will that believe. Right? Because it's a head final language. There are also mixed languages. So in German subordinate clauses, the verb comes last in the verb phrase, and arguably tense comes last in the tense phrase. But the subordinating conjunction that comes first in the larger sentence. So you say that, I believe that Mary books read will. That's German, right? In spoken Afrikaans, the verb comes last in the verb phrase, books read, like Japanese. But tense comes first in the tense phrase, like English, will books read. And the that comes first as well. So languages care where their heads go with respect to what they merge with. You could imagine two other kinds of mixed languages. For example, in literary Martian, the verb comes first as it does in English. And the tense comes first as it does in English. So you will read books, right? But the subordinating conjunction comes last as it does in Japanese. And in Old High Venusian, right, the verb precedes the object like English, but tense and the subordinating conjunction follow their things they merge with as in Japanese. Right? I mean, the fact that I've called these languages literary Martian and Old High Venusian probably gives away the punchline, which is linguists observe that these languages do not exist, that there is in fact a universal property of languages that allows verb phrases to be verb final while the tense phrase might be tense initial, but doesn't allow the opposite order. So it doesn't allow the verb to be initial in the verb phrase while the tense is final in the tense phrase. It's called the final over final constraint, and it's a constraint that governs the position of heads of phrases. Now, just to lower your expectations, I am unfortunately not about to argue that the final over final constraint has been detected in musical structure as well. That would be even more exciting than the talk that I'm going to give today. But I'm just presenting it so non-linguists have an idea of the kinds of reasons why it's important when we look at phrases in language to know what the head is, that the notion of head is important. Now let's talk about music. So the GTTM model has a kind of official architecture that we're not going to talk about. That's a clip from the book. Okay? I want to zero in on one component of that architecture. So if we look at one component that Lerdahl and Jackendorf called prolongational reduction, you've seen some examples like in Carol's talk towards the end. So Lerdahl and Jackendorf proposed that the harmonic structure of a piece of tonal music is organized into a binary branching headed tree that they call prolongational reduction, whose heads are chosen in a particular way so as to diminish distance between sisters, between nodes that belong to the same phrase, and maximize stability of connections between pitch events. One member of each pair of nodes in this tree is picked by the GTTM model as the head. So consider a very annoying little melody that we composed that sounds like this, if I can get it to play. So as we saw, I think Carol explained these trees to you, a GTTM model might assign the harmony that we're looking at here a structure that looks roughly like that. Right? And this is in fact a binary branching tree where pairs of chords are combined into units. And the geometry of the diagrams that they presented in the book identifies one of every such pair as the head. Right? So that's represented by the straight line segment versus coming off at an angle. So for example, if this is the right structure for the first two notes, we're identifying the tonic chord at the beginning of the piece as the head of the constituent that contains these two chords. Right? It should be obvious that this is essentially the same kind of structure, right, that a linguist might draw in this way. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is simply the number of the chord in the sequence. There's no significance aside from that. But we could simply identify the phrase containing these two elements as headed by the first chord in the sequence. And the third chord here still produces a phrase headed by that element, and so on and so on and so on. Right? Just like that. Right? So it's really essentially the same kind of formal object in every detail that linguists think is properly associated with the structure of a sentence. For Lerdahl, these patterns reflect a hierarchical structure of the sort we heard about in Carol's talk, in which the tension associated with an event it depends in part on its context in the structures that we're looking at. And these patterns are not explainable in purely left-right string-adjacent terms. We'll come back to that in a second. Lerdahl and Carol Kromhansel did the experiment that we heard briefly about at the end of her talk that suggests the relevance of structures of this sort to speakers' intuitions of one sort, to listeners' intuitions, one sort or another. Okay, so recall this silly melody that's very annoying that we talked about. The kinds of structures that we're looking at here can be justified in a number of ways. Okay? So first of all, these structures can be viewed as arising from the same recursive merge rule that linguists think is responsible for the structure of sentences. Right? So it's merge because it involves hierarchical structure, and it's recursive because the rules governing what merges with what and the choice of head appear to be the same throughout the structure. And so you can easily imagine, building up the kind of tree that we've been talking about, that what we're doing is we're taking as basic building blocks of chords, and we merge chord 1 with chord 2, forming the phrase or the set 1, 2, and identifying the first element by musical principles as the head. And then we take chord 3, right, and we merge it with the set we just created by merging 1 and 2, once again by musical principles identifying chord number 1 as the head, and so on. Right? And you keep doing that, right, and the result will look like what we just saw. And this structure can be justified in a number of ways. One of them is the basic principle behind the simplest form of theme and variations. Right? So you take a melody of the sort that we've just heard. You're going to get sick of this. And perform that melody, deleting, for example, the non-heads of, say, this constituent and that constituent. Right? And the result is this, hopefully. Yeah, this happened last time I did it. Can't get it to kind of play instead of changing the page. Ah, good. And now let's delete some more non-heads. Let's delete the non-head of that, right? And the non-head of that. And the result, if once I manage to play it, if I get the right cursor, not the wrong cursor, is and the observation is that each of these not only kind of sounds like the same kind of insipid music that the original tune sounds like, but it sounds like a simplified version of the original tune. This is no news to any musician out there, but it's a very interesting phenomenon that merits our attention. Right? Because if we, and we can simplify it even more. Deleting more non-heads. But it begins to be not only insipid, but trivial. But that's not my problem. Right? And what's crucial is it's not just deleting anything you feel like, right? So if I just sort of take a random pass through the melody and delete notes, for example, deleting the heads of some of these constituents, while not deleting their non-heads, you might end up with this, for example. And that's a lovely set of dominant seventh chords, and I won't complain about it, but it doesn't sound like the melody in any way. Right? We've deleted the wrong thing. So deleting non-heads yields a sensation of a simplified version of the same piece. Right? Deleting randomly, you don't know what you're going to get, but it's not going to sound like the same piece. That's actually the intuition, one of the intuitions that the structure is representing in the first place. Now, again, picking up a point that we've heard in a couple of the other talks, the fact that reductions sound like a version of the same piece illustrates not only the relevance of the notion of structure and heads, but also that the relevance of that the notion of hierarchical structure headed in the fashion that we've been positing predicts and produces non-local interactions between musical events that are not in the full piece linearly adjacent to one another. Right? We could call this Schenker's generalization, that two chords interact harmonically, forming, say, a tension-relaxation pair, so long as they are the heads of phrases that merge with each other. Right? And crucially, the heads need not be adjacent to one another. So another set of examples that time will not permit me to go through, but showing much the same thing. Right? Okay. And the same notion, head, explains the same kind of non-local interactions in language. So for example, tense needs to merge with the verb phrase. But so Mary will almost certainly happy, right, is not English, because almost certainly happy is a lovely adjective phrase, but tense doesn't want an adjective phrase, it wants a verb phrase. But on the other hand, verb phrases are such that sometimes things can precede the verb, like adverbs. And tense is perfectly happy merging with a verb phrase, even when the verb of that verb phrase isn't immediately next to it. So Mary will almost certainly read the book is a perfectly fine sentence in English. We have a non-local interaction between will and read that's not disturbed by these adverbs, because will merge with something that read is the head of. Right? It's exactly the same principle. So now recall our proposal that formal differences between language and music are a consequence of differences in their fundamental building blocks, but in other respects, language and music are identical. Right? So there are differences in building blocks. Language makes use of a lexicon, music does not. Music makes use of positions in a scale system organized around an octave, and chords formed by combinations of these scale systems. Language does not, but the combinatorics are fundamentally the same. The distinct building blocks are combined by the same rule merge, forming identical binary branching hierarchical structures, including a notion of head. Okay. So, then the point of a special interest to linguists that I'll rush through a little bit because we're running short on time, but I don't want to rush through so quickly that you don't see it, because this I think is particularly interesting. So you might ask, does the result generalize? So far, I've just been recasting and realigning what's already in GTTM to point out the similarity to current views of language. You might ask, are all types of merge found in language also found in music? So if the identity thesis is correct, the answer should be yes, all things being equal. So you might ask, well, what about a species of merge that I haven't talked about so far, that some linguists call internal merge, and better known perhaps as syntactic movement? So let me first explain what that is. So given straightforward expectations concerning syntactic structure, and given the simplest ideas about how syntactic structure should be linearized, what's the linear order of the elements at the bottom, like where the heads go and where the other things go. Right? So for example, when two elements merge, the right edge of one element should align with the left edge of the other element. Right? It's interesting, and an old observation, really originally due to Chomsky, that in many cases, the otherwise predictable relation between hierarchical syntactic structure and phonological surface breaks down. So for example, in French, a transitive verb like to buy, right, that we have every reason to think merges with the same kind of direct object nominal that we find in English, can be separated from that direct object by negation. Right? That really shouldn't happen, right, in the simplest view of how language works. So French doesn't say the girl doesn't buy the book, it says the girl buys not the book. Il n'achètera pas le livre, will not buy the book. Okay. This is a sort of this is a phenomenon that has a number of hallmarks to it. So when the girl will not buy the book in French, right, the verb and the dash is in the wrong place, but the verb and the part of the verbal morphology, the suffixes at the end, that indicates future, which really includes that R there, typo, are glued closely to one another. The verb's not next to its object, but it's incorporated into itself the morphology that in English would be the freestanding word will. Right? So that's one interesting property. Another is that there is a verb phrase. Right? You can have adverbs in here, you would have as many direct objects as the verb takes. That is, the verb has a normal set of syntactic dependents that are sitting exactly next to where we would have expected the verb to be linearized, except the verb is linearized in a funny place. That is, despite the dislocation to tense of the verb itself, there's still a verb phrase, just the verb isn't sitting inside it. So there's a theory of this that says what's going on in constructions like this is that the verb buy, in this case, did undergo merge with its direct object, the book, just as it should have, and should have been linearized right next to it. But what happened was that after merging with its direct object, it merged a second time, this time with tense, which is why it's showing up sitting next to tense, instead of sitting next to its direct object. So in tree terms, it would look sort of like this. Here's where the verb should be, but my goodness, the verb upped and merged the second time, right, with the tense element, right, and gets pronounced in its new position. This phenomenon is called head movement. Here it's head movement of the verb to tense. It's very common across languages. English used to do it, right, but then they got out of the habit sometime around Shakespeare's time. Lots of languages do it. There's another property we can observe for head movement in French, which is the movement of the finite, or the remerging of the finite verb with tense in French seems to satisfy some need of another element in the structure. And that element is probably tense itself, because when you have an infinitival clause, the verb doesn't move there. It occurs right next to its direct object where it should after negation. Okay? So you can view the process as involving an alteration of the properties of tense. Tense has a need for the verb to come to it. The verb comes to it, tense is happy. Right? So it's a way of satisfying a requirement of tense to move the verb to it. And that's why the movement is obligatory. When you have finite tense, it just has to happen in French. If it doesn't, you're not speaking French. Skip over property 4. So are there cases in music in which an otherwise expected relation between structure and linear order breaks down in this way? Well, it's kind of complicated, but we think maybe yes if you look in the right place. So what you look for is what would you look for if music showed head movement, like French? So you look for a situation in which some chord X must be performed adjacent to another chord Y, despite having a normal set of syntactic dependence of its own.
And you might look for that process to be obligatory and arguably related to some need of Y. Right? Let's skip 4 as we did before. Okay? So what Jonah and I argue in this paper is that there is in total music a phenomenon that has these properties, and that's the phenomenon known as a cadence, or the perfect cadence. So a cadence is a sequence of 2 chords, a dominant and a tonic. Let's represent them by the Greek letters delta and tau for dominant and tonic, where tau is a chord that's typically built on the first note of the scale, the pitch collection called the tonic, and delta is a major triad, most often built, but not always, on the pitch 5 scale steps higher than the tonic. And the cadence is a major structural signpost that establishes key and marks the ends of sections of tonal pieces if they're not playing games with a listener. What we find interesting is that the cadence has the following additional properties. That the dominant in a cadence must be linearly adjacent to the tonic, despite the fact that it participates in its own, it has its own musical dependence, prototypically what's called the subdominant, some other chord like built on the 4th degree of the scale, and a couple of other options as well, that depends on the dominant. So for example, in simple melody, the last 2 chords are quite properly a cadence consisting of a dominant immediately followed by a tonic chord. Okay, no surprise to music people in the audience. Okay. So another property, I mean, if you like to listen to Debussy or Messiaen or something, you're going to not like the way I put this. But another property is obligatoriness, right? So if in a standard tonal piece, right, the piece is to be established as being in the key of tau, right? There has to be a cadence involving a dominant of tau followed by tau. It's a precondition for a piece that feels like it was in the key of tau. So if we were a linguist talking about this, what you'd say is that tau, the tonic, is marked as a tonic of a particular key by virtue of being in a particular relation to delta, to the dominant. Right? So, and since a tonal piece must be in some key, a piece must be headed by a tonic marked chord. Okay? And since Western tonal pieces are right-headed, a piece in a standard Western tonal idiom must end with a cadence, it must end with a tonic marked chord. So here's what we think is interesting. Why is adjacency between the 2 chords a precondition for the piece, for the key of the piece being established? Why is head adjacency a condition of the dominant marking a particular chord as a tonic of the key? Why isn't it sufficient simply for a phrase headed by the dominant, for a constituent headed by the dominant, to merge with a constituent headed by the tonic, even if the dominant and tonic chords themselves are not adjacent to each other? That is, why is head adjacency a condition on having a cadence? This is very surprising given GTTM and given the Schenkerian foundations of the rest of musical syntax. Because the whole point of GTTM and the whole point of Schenker is that harmonic, and the whole point, something that Carol brought up in her talk, is that harmonic relations in general may be long distance. Right? All other musical relations between chords appear to require just adjacency between larger units headed by particular chords, not adjacency between the heads themselves. That was the whole point of playing all those reductions of the melody. It still sounded like music, and it still sounded like a simplified version of the melody. There's an exception, the cadence. Right? The actual 2 chords have to be next to each other. So for example, I could play this for you, but you probably all know it. It's the C major prelude from the Well-Tempered Clavier. Da 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 da. You don't want me to sing, but you probably also don't want me to try to click on that because that'll take an extra 2 minutes to hear it. Right? This, like every other well-mannered tonal piece, ends with a dominant of C major immediately followed by the tonic chord. Right? Now, analysis of this piece given by Leonard Adjacency, I'm told it has some questionable properties, but not questionable properties of relevance to what I'm about to say. Right? This piece contains any number of other dominant chords, including, for example, this one, chord 25, which is the same kind of dominant 7th chord that would be a beautiful chord to mark the final chord of the piece as a tonic of C major. And in their analysis, and this part of the analysis is probably right, it happens to be a sister of that final chord. So if you were doing a reduction and you left out all of this junk, it wouldn't sound like Bach, and you might get drummed out of the music department for omitting those chords, right? But it would still sort of sound like a recognizable variation on the piece that you know and love, right? Okay. However, despite the fact that this is telling us that chord 25 is a sister of the final chord, structurally, you still need another occurrence of the dominant 7th chord in second to last position of the piece, or it won't sound like a satisfying piece ending in C major. Right? There still has to be a 5/7 chord, a dominant chord, immediately preceding the final chord of the piece. Okay? So again, if tonal harmony is all about head-to-head relations, why isn't chord 25 sufficient to produce a sensation of cadence for the final chord? Take it from me, it's not. Right? And in fact, it's not just the fact about this Bach piece. You know, more or less all normal pieces in the Western tonal idiom are like this. They end with a perfect cadence. Right? Here's what Jean-Philippe Rameau said about it. It's a certain way of ending a strain which is so satisfying that we desire nothing further after it. But to get that feeling of satisfaction, the final chord has to be immediately preceded by a dominant. So if music is all about heads, why isn't chord 25 sufficient to produce that Rameau sensation of satisfaction? Why must the dominant be adjacent to the final tonic? Now you can ask the same question in language. You could say if language is all about heads, why isn't the fact that tense merges with the verb phrase enough to produce a sensation of grammaticality in French? Why must the verb and tense actually be next to each other? And we have an answer to that, right? The answer for French, there should be a slide here, but the answer for French was that, well, the tense note in French has a certain need that causes the verb to merge a second time directly with it. Right? And that need is satisfied by that movement, but it has as a result that the verb and the tense are string adjacent, right next to each other. So what Jonah and I propose is that that's exactly what's going on in the cadence. That the reason that the dominant and the tonic have to be right next to each other is that the tonic had a certain need, right? That is, I want to be the tonic of the piece. And to satisfy that need, the dominant has to head move to it. Consequence of that, the two have to be adjacent. So it's this coupling of the notion, I have a need that has to be satisfied by another head, and the adjacency that results from that we speculate is behind the adjacency requirement on cadences, which is otherwise unprecedented in musical structure. Right? So in our little insipid melody, right, we have head movement of a dominant, which may start somewhere over there, but has to end up immediately next to the final tonic, and at the end of the Bach C major prelude, we would posit the same process. So linguists might ask about various ways in which this musical argument is different from the linguistic argument, and I'll come back to that if you want me to come back to this slide in the question period. I just want to summarize the evidence and then conclude. Okay? So what we argue is that the presence of an absolute string adjacency condition on a pair of heads linked to the satisfaction of a need on the higher head in a domain of musical grammar where all other interactions require only sisterhood between phrases headed by X and Y, never linear adjacency between chords X and Y itself, right, supports the notion that there is something like head movement going on in music as well. That is, not just the kind of merge that GTTM posits, but also the more sophisticated kind of second merge that linguists need to explain what's going on in French is a property of music as well. So we think that if this pans out at the end, that is, if the various sorts of merge and the needs that merge satisfies turn out to be similar in music to what we find in language, the identity thesis in general is supported. So I have a bunch of other slides that I'll skip over for time reasons. The big picture that I'd like to suggest is that the identity thesis for language and music is quite possibly supported. That is, all formal differences between language and music are a consequence of differences in their fundamental building blocks. In all other respects, language and music are identical. Let me back off very slightly. I at least would like to argue that this is a fruitful hypothesis to start with. That is, if you start, given that we have the hunch that there are similarities, which we owe to GTTM, they in turn owe to the Schenker tradition in music theory, right? If we start out with the proposal that they are completely identical, right? And then we're inspired to go and look for the ways in which they're different, to the extent that we can explain them as a consequence of the basic building blocks being different, the identity thesis is supported. To the extent that we cannot, we find ways in which they are different besides the basic building blocks that we would never discover if we started out with the opposite proposal, that music and language have nothing to do with each other, and then sort of hope that by rummaging around we might discover some similarities. So even if the identity thesis proves to be too strong, or maybe even completely wrong, it's probably the most interesting because strongest hypothesis to begin with, and then the work that should proceed is the work that will try to show that it's false, and if it succeeds, then we learn something from that. So that's work that probably people more qualified than Jonah and I in the area of music theory and in related areas of linguistics hopefully will be interested enough to carry out. But for today, that's what I have to tell you about the identity thesis. So thank you very much. Please.
So, like, what we get out of the reductions are like less and less information until we get that one note that's like the whole, like.
Right, yeah, I didn't take it to the single note, but yes, that would be the determination.
So, since that single note no longer has any semantic musical meaning at all anymore, it's unable to really produce any sort of emotive response, and that you're not disambiguating the semantics of the music because there won't be any ambiguity. The syntax will always be the same in the music. You know what I mean? Like there's not going to be like a structural ambiguity. Oh, I'm interpreting this different, so I'm getting a totally different like semantic meaning out of it. So like, doesn't that fundamentally make it different than language syntax?
So I actually spoke too soon. So if I just played you the final C major chord and you had a way as a listener of knowing that it had been tonic marked by a dominant, right, that would be the ultimate reduction. But in the real world, if I simply play you the C major chord, you have no way of knowing that it's been tonic marked by the dominant, except if I also play you the dominant preceding it. Right. So I spoke too soon. Does that begin to answer a bit of your question? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm wondering how this analysis might be modified if you're dealing with music where you can't identify a tonal center, and hence the head.
Yeah. I mean here I can't even speak as the semi-qualified person that I spoke as while giving most of the talk. I'll just speak as a citizen. Right. I mean, my hunch is that when one listens to music, or at least music in the Western tradition, that's atonal. Right? I don't know about other indigenous systems, but I think this came up in somebody's comment as a side remark as well. My hunch is that one often has the sensation of this music being much more tiring and sort of effortful to listen to than say music that's straightforwardly tonal. My guess is that's our tonality parser working overtime to try to identify relations that would make sense in a tonal system that are just very hard to extract from that musical surface. So my guess is that if the parser fails, right, you really are falling outside of the system. It's like listening to a language that you don't know. Right, and that to the extent that it might occasionally not fail, it's because you've somehow managed to identify tonic marked things or phrases that if they continued in a way that they don't in fact continue would make musical sense. My guess is it's that effort that sort of one is sensitive to. I always think, we heard some Weber earlier today. I always thought that one of the most brilliant things Weber did was to make his pieces incredibly short. Right. Not so much because thank God it's over, right? But because if you're interested in sort of pure sound and what it feels like to be floating in tonal space, not quite knowing where you are, right? You want to end it quickly while the sensation is still, hasn't tired you out yet. Right. So that's not a very sophisticated answer to your question, but that's the best one I can give you. Yeah.
So maybe it's kind of a follow-up.
Yeah.
Could you use, I mean, based on what you've got here with the identity thesis, could you generate some predictions about what would be a Venusian music system, right? Like, presumably there should be impossible kinds of music systems and possible ones, right?
I mean, because we've done very little, right, I can't answer your question in any sophisticated way. Right? I mean, you know,
Also a very sophisticated question.
yeah, right. Right. So, for example, you know, if it's, you know, there's more stuff that I was able to talk about. We discussed in the paper the notion of key establishment and sketched the beginnings of a theory of modulation in that light. So, you know, a Venusian system that had another way of establishing key, for example, would you know, other than tonic marking a particular chord, would be something unexpected given what I'm doing here. I mean, there's a more sort of, you know, potentially more interesting avenue of investigation that would respond to your question that I also we haven't gone down, right? But which would be, what's the range of possible human music systems? Okay, so, you know, here I just straightforwardly don't know the answer. But you could even ask the following sorts of questions that arise in this work, right? So, given that I began by showing you, say, English versus Japanese, right? Is there, you know, a counterpart to Western tonal music that stands in the same relation to it that the simple facts I mentioned about Japanese Japanese syntax stand into English, right? So, you know, there's some brief discussion in GTTM about some system somewhere where the tonic is established at the beginning of the piece, and they cite some paper by somebody from some culture, or rather, I don't remember what that is anymore, right? Now, suppose it turns out that there is no such system, right? We know there's variation in musical systems, but suppose there's no, you know, anti-Western tonal music in that sense, right? So where the, you know, or where the relation, or the linear relation of dominant and tonic are reversed. I don't know, I would not know of any correlate to that in language. So that, you know, at least I know what to ask. Say, okay, is it in some way a natural consequence of putting together by LaMERG, you know, chords that stand in a particular relation to one another, of tension and relaxation, and, you know, make sense in a tonal system, versus lexical items that have as a result that it has to be the Western tonal way and it couldn't be the other way, right? And if we can't come up with that sort of proposal, right, that's one of the places where one might begin to learn that the identity thesis is wrong in some particular place. So at least I know the kinds of questions one would ask if one knew certain things. And I'm stymied by the fact that I don't know the things that I need to know in order to know what questions to ask. Dan was it?
Oh, yeah. Just I mean, these are more related to you know, syntax than the box, but it would seem that in order to be able to move the 5 onto the 1 or whatever, that you have to have the dominant upstream before you could move it. So that would predict that in any of these compositions you'd have to have a source for the head that you move on to the previous head, and that makes me wonder about whether in this theory you need something like, I don't know, expletive do support or something when you don't have something like expletive do support to take the syntactic analog when you don't have a preceding dominant that can supply the head that you would move on to the final head. Whether there's some case, some genre of music or something where you would just by default insert something, you know, insert the dominant to support that head. This is sort of working off the tense analogy that you have, like, for example, English negation, where you, for some reason, can't raise the verb up, but you don't have to.
Like, it's a good question. So this slide, I'm sort of anticipating where you were going. This slide is actually kind of relevant. So I mean, the problem for doing this work with music, or rather the problem with the Heddenbit argument for music, relates to the difference in building. Let me start again. There's a problem that arises from the difference in building blocks that weakens our argument in ways that are relevant to your question. Right? So that's what the slide is about. So in language, like if you remember my French demonstration, we have a way of knowing what position the verb would have occupied if it had not moved to T, right? And we can know this even internal to French, because in non-finite clauses, as I mentioned, the verb doesn't do the same thing that it does in finite clauses. But we also have reasons from looking at all sorts of other languages to know where the verb should have been if it had not moved, right? Okay. And that's because, for example, the verb combines with direct objects, and sometimes that's an obligatory requirement. As I mentioned in a question after Nicole and John's talk, you know, a verb like devour in English we teach in intro syntax classes is obligatorily transitive, unlike its near synonym eat. So I can say Mary ate, and I don't have to say what. But if I say Mary devoured, it's not English because you have to specify the direct object. And aside from at the cadence point, and maybe for different reasons, we kind of don't have that in Western tonal music. So actually, if I weren't lazy, I would rewrite these slides because they confuse many people with their honesty. Because, you know, I would love to be able to say that this chord here, or, you know, this chord here started 72 chords to the left, right, and moved there to show you that it actually is moving, right? But I can't show you that because there's no requirement that any chord over there could possibly make that would convince us that this dominant started there somewhere. No requirement like the transitivity requirement for the verbs in English. So I'm left with the argument that it has to be adjacent to this final chord, and that's obligatory, and if it's not there, it's bad. So going back to your question, you know, could we identify a situation where there was no dominant able to move to this tonic, and some other process inserted it? To the best of my knowledge, we can't ask that question, because we have no way of telling whether somewhere off to the left there's a dominant that moves somewhere else. So that's a sense in which the argument for music is weaker than the argument for language, and I know of no way to make it stronger. Yeah, please.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. I keep thinking, this is so interesting, but I keep thinking about this cadence example, and why 5 followed by 1 is very different than 5 with intervening chords. But Lerdel's third component, the attraction component, only concerns the relationship between adjacent chords, which can explain why say the dominant 7 to the 1 when they're right close together is different. And it has to do with how close the tones are in pitch proximity, and also the relative positions in the tonal hierarchy, which relates to this question, why is a 5 way back there actually related? It's setting up the tonal hierarchy that establishes that attraction relationship later. I mean, it's a possible story for it. Do you think?
So in a way, I think there's a way, we can translate that story into conceivably a version of the question that I asked in this very talk, right? So you could say, okay, granted that the piece is in the key of C, right? A 5 chord in a structurally prominent position, a dominant chord, say, somewhere in the middle of the piece, right, is going to warrant, say, in the mind of a skilled listener, an attachment of that chord structurally to the final tonic, if I can find the slide. Yeah, so like we'll warrant this attachment right there. Okay, then we say, okay, fine. This is warranted by the fact that we're pretty sure this whole thing is in the key of C, so that's how we're going to attach this here. And you said that sets us up for an attraction theory that requires another occurrence of that chord to be right next to the final chord. That's where we see a question. Am I misunderstanding?
A little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not that it requires the 5 to be before the 1, but when the 5 occurs, for all the reasons that have to do with tonal structure, the 1 then is such a good resolution, there's such strong attraction.
Okay, but why does the 0.35 have to exist? I mean, granted that once it's there, it's strongly attracted to the final tone.
Right.
But why does it have to be?
If you look at the way the notes move, in a leading tone sort of sense, they just fit.
Okay, So for us, we make that into a question. So what we say is, well, given that the rest of the model, right, being structurally adjacent is enough to satisfy your desires and wishes if you're a 5-chord, right? Okay, so why, so we think it's an interesting question why at this particular point in the structure you have to have string adjacency, right? What I hear you saying when you are channeling Lerdo, right, is that that's a fact. There's something called attraction that requires adjacency. So we'd like to say, well, maybe that's a sign that maybe what attraction is the musical analog of the kind of requirement we see in language that causes one head to have to end up being string adjacent to another as well. Let me put a third bit before you. So suppose I went off to French and I said I have something called attraction theory. And attraction theory says, let's say that, you know, the finite verb in French has a property that creates a very strong attraction that wants it to be next to the tense morpheme, right? I mean, that would sound a bit like an informal version of the head proposal that I made. So perhaps all that Jonah and I are doing is pointing out that analogy.
I guess I'm missing why the 5 has such a strong, okay, why you want the 5 to precede the 1 is that in terms of the calculated tension, that gives the greatest drop in tension. It's the largest way of dropping tension.
Fair enough. So it's an alternative proposal that to mark the piece as being in C, you need the maximum tension drop at the end. Okay, that's worth thinking about. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that could, in principle, be an alternative, and something that I don't know a linguistic correlate for.
Two or maybe 3-part question.
Yeah.
How far back in the history of Indo-European languages does LaMERG apply?
So when you look, putting aside the notorious pure aha controversy, if you wanted me to stay for another hour, we could talk about that. Right. So anytime, to my knowledge, it's controversial to some people, but I think, anytime someone's looked carefully at a language, at the syntax of any language I know of, it turns out, so far, that overall its syntactic structure is the kind of thing we've been talking about here. Right? So there are many proposals for that languages that superficially look rather different from English, where you have more freedom of word order and so forth, or languages that work in some fundamentally different way. And it's not true that all those languages have been studied carefully. But when they are, it sort of always turns out that there's evidence that they're really much more like, English or Japanese or something than we might think. So back speaking about Indo-European, where we don't have living speakers of classical Greek or Hittite or so forth, but I was just hearing a talk by one of our students yesterday on tense and Hittite. To the extent that you can deduce from the extant record what the properties of those languages probably were, it looks like they are variations on the languages that are spoken today, which means something like merges apply.
So the time span, we could easily say 2,500 or 3,000? Or?
I mean, if you get Chomsky here, not only will there be more people in the audience, but he will advance speculations about the great leap forward, the gene that got merged into the human species. I'm not going to do that.
No.
Right. So I don't know.
So that is perfect to this question. The music that we're talking about here in saying tonal music applies to what part of this span?
Oh, it's a fraction.
I mean, roughly starting 1750, maybe evolving, and up until, well, today, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, would you have any thoughts on music that existed up until roughly 1750?
No. I mean, you're asking a diachronic version of a question you could also ask synchronically. Do I have any thoughts on, name your favorite musical system that's as far as possible from Western music that's alive today. This is the talk is essentially a thesis and a challenge, right? So when you look at the history, say, of generative research, the generative grammar, modern research, and the syntax of the world's languages, it started with a serious investigation of a very tiny number of languages. Chomsky worked intensively on English to begin with, right? And then soon people were working on a few other languages, and now there's tons of languages under investigation. And many things that we thought might be properties of all languages because of what we learned from English have fallen by the wayside when we look at other languages, and then other things we thought surely must be special properties of English turn out to be universal. But you don't know until you start the investigation somewhere. So, Jonah and I, not only being amateurs in music theory, we are also, to the extent that we're competent at all on this topic, we're competent in this tiny little tradition of the last 200 years, so that's where we start. It also has the advantage of a rich base of theory, which is not true for most of the musical systems that have existed. It's entirely possible that all sorts of things I said today will not be relevant to many other systems, and that may challenge what I said. And I'm comfortable with that.
Actually, I'm thinking that this is great for explaining tonal music, and I'm thinking one of the forces or factors that contributed to this is, I don't know the history of that specifically, but the way that we started talking about music used to be using pictorial metaphors, and up until around the time when the music phenomenon started, the metaphors that we used to describe it went into talking about phrases and whatnot. So we started using linguistic metaphors, and I'm wondering, I'm not imagining that you necessarily had thought about this that much, but how those two interact.
So if this work is going to go anywhere, then you have to take what we're saying as not a metaphor. Right? And so Bernstein's lectures were sort of a metaphor. What's musical syntax? What's musical phonology? We're deadly serious. Right? So what we're saying is, literally the rule systems are the same, right? And new phenomena that we don't understand, say music, might benefit from, thinking about what we might have learned in analyzing language, and conversely, things we don't understand in language. So it's our hope that it's not a metaphor at all.
I'm not suggesting that you're describing it as a metaphor, but the way we started thinking about music, then started enacting music more like language.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, but it also could be that this little slice of musical history is the musical system that's language-based. Maybe this is where you're heading. And other music and other things we are informally calling music, might actually be cognitively different from this in some deep way. Conceivable. Maybe that'd be very interesting.
So, first I have a question. More for music, for whoever. But isn't it the case that you can establish the tonic without any 5 chords at all?
So
right? It should be easy.
Say a little more, because I think I know what you're asking.
Well, in other words, you don't need in previous places here. There don't have to be any previous instances of 5 chords until you get to the cadence. You could already be established that you're in C major by having the F and all the, however that works. I assume the ladle system you would converge on C major without ever having had a G major.
Sure, I mean, the D minor passage we heard this morning that annoyed us by not having its final D minor, we knew was in D minor because of the pitch collection.
No, we had a 5 chord.
Oh, maybe we had a 5.
So it's the opposite case.
Yeah.
But you still need it for the cadence.
You still need it for the cadence.
And you still need it to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But so my question is about the sort of if this is not a metaphor, right? And this is so we call these things movement in language, although internal merge is now what it's called, because we can identify 2 different positions that the element is associated with. The one that it had to come from, which is what Dan was asking about, and you. For you guys, for the differences in building blocks, you can't identify the position that it came from.
Yeah.
You can only identify the position where it ended up.
And ask the properties about what the properties are.
Right. Yeah. But so why wouldn't the right comparison be more to a phonological effect rather than syntactic effect? That is, what's required. What we know is true, if everything else you said is right, is that you need adjacency, right? But there's no evidence, possibly just because of the systems being different, that it's in any way associated with any other position besides the one where it has to end up. So isn't it more like a clitic adjacency requirement than a movement? Because if you say this is not a metaphor, there have to be 2 positions to establish the requirement for movement. And, right?
Well, this has a lot of...
Can I be able to that question?
I'm sorry?
Can I add something to that question? Okay, yeah, but maybe it's something that I don't understand. So if you say that they have the same architecture or the same composition, which is merge, so could you please explain me why you need to argue for internal marriage in that case? Because internal marriage is driven by the features of the lexicon. So we have different ingredients, as you said, but the recipe is the same. You need merge. And you have internal marriage because of the ingredients. So maybe I'm with Young here, because maybe it doesn't seem to be more like internal marriage in the musical composition.
So let me say the best thing I can say, which is probably not going to be good enough. So first of all, John's suggestion has a bit the logical structure of Carol's suggestion. That is, there could be other reasons in the system why there's an adjacency requirement against the Schenkerian GTTM background in which everything else involves long-distance relations. And that's fair enough. So one would want to then, I'm not going to satisfactorily answer your question, right? So her suggestion was that there might be a reason why pieces want to end with the greatest possible, tension contrast between pairs of elements. You're suggesting that if there is something in language that this is the musical counterpart of, there are things other than the product of internal merge in language that have an adjacency property. So, harmony processes, assimilation processes in phonology, for example. Or criticization, I think you mentioned or one of you mentioned criticization. That could be an instance of internal merge producing adjacency between things. So that's a variant of our proposal. And I don't have a satisfying answer to these. So you're both, I'm happy because you're both taking up the notion that there's a question here, which makes me happy intrinsically. That is, it's a question that to the best of my knowledge, has not been previously asked, which is, can we find reasons why against the Schenkerian background in which long-distance relations are, are crucial, certain other processes require adjacency. And it's entirely, I don't have any brilliant thoughts to answer your questions with, it's entirely possible that question deserves a different answer than the one we gave, right? So picking up what I think both of you said, I would simply caution that to be careful about where the weakness of our argument lies, right? I don't think it lies, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think it lies so much in our conclusion, which of course could be wrong, as in the absence of some evidence for the conclusion. Let me say that better. Right, so when we teach in intro syntax class internal merge, or we teach movement, right, we have 6 or 7 converging arguments that we can give from all sorts of places and different constructions and so forth. Many of which center on our ability to identify a surprising gap somewhere in the sentence, and then note that there appears to be a filler for that gap. Right? That's not the only thing we talk about, but that's one of the things we talk about. Right? And so not having that for music is, at least as a logical matter, not an argument against our proposal. It's just a weakness in the arguments for our proposal. And, I'm the first one to concede that. Right? But it's not in the essence of internal merge that we know where the element first moved. Right? It's the linguist's job to be able to say, oh, look where it first, where it came from. And sadly, I don't have a tool for doing that in music. That could mean that we're wrong. It could mean that someday we'll have that tool and we'll turn out we're right. Or it could mean we're right and we'll never be in a position to really know it. Right? The last one is the only sad one there. Right? It turns out we're wrong, at least we asked the question. Any other questions, comments? So thank you.